Kia ora koutou, everybody, and welcome to the second iPEN webinar for this year. And today we're fortunate to have James Hutchinson from KiwiNet talking to us about impact pathways. I'm going to open with a karakia and then I will hand over to James. Stop sharing my screen, he can get himself sorted out. But yeah, warm welcome to you all and hope the sun is shining where you are. It's a glorious day down in Otautahi, Christchurch today. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa pounamu te moana. Hei huri ahi mā tātou e te rangi nei, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou e a tātou katoa. Hui e, tai kia.
Tai kia.
Hello.
All right, well, thanks again, James. Great to have you. And I will, pass the speaking stick over your way, and I'll put myself on mute.
Excellent, Cara. And you can hear me okay? Good, well, that's the first hurdle passed. Fantastic. I will share my screen. Okay, is that working? Yep, great, excellent. Well, kia ora koutou katoa. Ko wai ahau, no tamaki makaurau ahau, ke kirikiriroa ahau e noho ana, ko tangata tiriti ahau, ko James Hutchinson toko ingoa. So I'm originally from Auckland and I now live in Hamilton, so you probably could say I'm a bit of a lapsed Jaffa that moved to Hamilton in 2014 after a long period in the UK, well, about 10 years. So what I'm going to cover today, first of all, just really grateful to be invited to have this kōrero with you today about commercialisation as an impact pathway. And up front, I really just want to acknowledge the awesome work that iPEN has been doing these last few years to really build up the impact framework that they've been developing and all the pathways that go with it. It's a really important work, and I think it has the opportunity to make a real transformational impact for us as a sector in terms of how we work. So we're going to be talking about commercialisation today. I'm going to cover what it is, as I see it, including the kind of the activities, the sorts of outcomes we see and how it happens. We're going to talk a bit about the New Zealand ecosystem, how it works here, and then finish off with how you can get involved. So first of all, maybe just a little bit of background in terms of how I got here. So I did my undergraduate at the University of Auckland, originally in biological sciences, chemistry and pharmacology, before heading off to the UK to do a PhD in synthetic organic chemistry. So I was looking at natural products from the marine environment with interesting anti-cancer properties and trying to synthesize them, total synthesis. And then when I finished my PhD, I decided to take a little bit of a step sideways and get into the area of science policy. So I spent 5 years at the science and policy interface working with the Royal Society of Chemistry. And then I moved back to New Zealand in 2014. And it's funny how our careers kind of move in different directions. And I almost fell into the world of research commercialisation with KiwiNet, with the role with KiwiNet, because it's now based in Hamilton. And really haven't looked back. And I think for me, commercialisation, the reason I get involved, what KiwiNet's all about, is really because of a belief, and like a lot of scientists, the reason why we get into it in the first place is a belief in the power of our science to transform lives and change the world. And that really is the main purpose behind what I do today. So that's a little bit about me. So starting off with, well, what is commercialisation? How do we actually define it? Well, for a lot of people, it can look a little bit like this. And it's often a bit of a dirty word. So for a lot of researchers that I talk to around the ecosystem, it can often be seen as something that's a distraction. It's about selling out. It's about making money for someone. And often, about big business. Often what I hear from people is, well, I'm not really going to be doing that because I'm not commercial. I really only do public good science. And then there's almost this association with commercialisation as something that means I have to leave my research role and actually move into something that looks like working in a spin out or something that looks quite different. And often gets associated with, we have to give up publications if we're going to do commercialisation because we're talking about intellectual property and things like that. And so I think that's sort of one way of looking at it. But for me, it looks more like this instead. And this is another way of thinking of it, is that I think of commercialization as a mechanism to do good things in the world, where the pathway to impact for our research is to create a new product or service that can have some sort of impact on one of the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, these were released by the UN back in 2015, and something that we've now all become quite familiar with, and really kind of aligns with a lot of why we get into our research and we get into science in the first place, is actually how we can advance the knowledge that we're creating to make a meaningful impact on one of these challenges. And so I think of commercialization more as a mechanism to enable that to happen. And here's how I would justify that. So for me, commercialization in its simplest form is really about taking research and turning it into new products and services. So obviously that won't be fit for all research that we do, and so therefore not all research is right for commercialization. But I think of commercialization as the process to take new knowledge and to turn it into new products and services. So what do I mean by that? Examples might be a medical device or a new carbon capture technology. It might be a service, for instance, for modeling nitrate flows on farms. But the critical thing is here is it's about a pathway to create a product and service that in itself can have some wider impact in the world. So going down sort of one layer further, how would we get there? Essentially what we're trying to do is we're taking knowledge or research or some sort of discovery that sits in a laboratory, and we're trying to get it into the hands of end users. And this whole idea about progressing knowledge into the hands of users is probably that the nomenclature that we've now got quite used to talking about when we talk about impact and impact pathways. And I think it's one area that, particularly across the CRIs, I've seen has started to become much more front and center, is really thinking about how we involve end users in our research. And I'm always really conscious that for a lot of our researchers that work in CRIs, that there are a lot of challenges in being able to go out and speak with end users and engage them in what we do. Often that there's, we don't necessarily have a lot of permission in our day-to-day jobs, or we don't have the resources and time to actually be able to go out and do this sort of engagement. And so as we get into the conversation today, I'll be really keen to sort of start to talk about ways in which that might start to happen for those of you that struggle to find the time and permission, and easy ways that you can dip your toe in the water, because that's probably where it starts. But just by way of example, what I mean by a product or service that's come from research, I wanted to introduce Andrew Kralacek. Now, Andrew is was a scientist at Plant and Food Research, and Andrew has essentially been on quite a long journey in the last few years to found a company called Sentient Bio, and I wanted to put up as an example of a product. So Andrew's the founder and chief technology officer of Sentient Bio, and previously led the molecular sensing team at Plant and Food Research. So he spent about 19 years at Plant and Food determining how smell receptors in insects works. And then essentially what Sentient Bio is taking all of that knowledge around insect receptors and translating that into new products that can harness the power of insect olfactory systems to develop novel biosensors that can detect volatile organic chemicals in the environment or in different applications. So you could imagine that you could develop technologies for sort of detecting molecules that are involved in food production. You could imagine sensing technologies that are used to determine particular biomarkers of disease and human health, and there's lots of different ways in which that knowledge could be converted into new products. And so they're developing some of those early prototypes now within Sentient Bio, and have just been awarded a $1.7 million grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation last year to advance that work further. But we originally came across Andrew when he joined the KiwiNet's Emerging Innovator Program, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. So probably an important point that I wanted to cover off around the commercialization pathway is essentially, if we're going from laboratory to end users, really the critical intermediate point is how we develop a commercial entity that will ultimately deliver the benefit or deliver these products to the end users. And in order to form this commercial entity, we need basically wrap together our science into some sort of business model that can enable that science to essentially build scale and reach markets and achieve financial sustainability. Because it's really difficult to take something that is a raw discovery from the lab and get it into the hands of end users as a product or service without some sort of means of enabling that thing to be manufactured and scaled and to build up a financially sustainable model to enable it to get out into the world where it can be used. But I think there's an important distinction there, because I think we often get hung up when we think about commercialization as that intermediate commercial entity as the endpoint. And really, for me, this is the critical thing, is that commercial entity is really only the intermediate thing that we're getting our science into in order to be able to get to that longer term impact further down the track. So if I think about moving something from lab out into the hands of users, that's really where we're starting to see the potential impact that we envisaged our research would have in the first place, right? So thinking about Andrew's example of sentient bio earlier, when he was developing his insect receptor technology, he was thinking about ways in which that could have a positive impact on the environment or on people through health systems, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's about getting to that commercial entity to enable that impact to happen. So obviously, you know, that process in itself can have wide-ranging impacts, but it can also have economic impact too, in terms of the creation of jobs and other kind of diversification of the economy, et cetera, et cetera. And perhaps the other thing that's unique to the commercialization pathway is that the intermediate commercial entity that we form can also have an economic impact as well. But I think the thing to remember here is that it doesn't have to be one or the other, that actually it's about seeing that whole journey towards impact and where the role of that commercial entity fits in and not getting too fixated on that. Another thing to add here is that it's often easy to get hung up on whether something might stay in New Zealand or whether it goes offshore. Often when we talk about commercialization, we talk about things going offshore and perhaps being lost to New Zealand. And often the reality of a lot of the technologies that we might bring through is that we just don't have the size of the market or the capability and the deep pockets, the funds, to be able to kind of support something through to success in New Zealand, that ultimately, if we want to realize some of this broader impact, these sorts of technologies or these entities may need to go offshore. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because by doing that, we're obviously being able to scale the amount of impact that we're having. But what we find is that the money that's gone into that entity in the first place and the talent will often cycle back through into the local ecosystem to enable that to work on the next thing. So I think there's part of the conversation that we need to have nationally is about getting comfortable with some of our commercial things that are coming out of our science system and ultimately going offshore, because they're going to need to do that in order to get to success and to build scale. One of the most famous examples in New Zealand is LanzaTech, which was a biotech company that many of you will be familiar with, that develops carbon recycling technology to convert waste gases from industrial processes into sustainable fuels and chemicals. Very famously kind of left New Zealand, I think back in the early teenies, and relocated to Chicago. They've just recently listed on the NASDAQ and are valued at around about $700 million US. But the positive story for New Zealand about LanzaTech is not only is it going on to create some real impact on a technology that could have a big impact on climate change, but a lot of the funding and the talent that was originally involved in LanzaTech has now stayed or recycled back into New Zealand. And so we've got some really good examples in Dotterel, Mint Innovation, Avatana as examples of local deep tech startup companies that have come off the back of the LanzaTech journey from the people that stayed in New Zealand and redid new things. So there's some really interesting things to think about that in terms of how we support our technologies out into the world through this commercialization pathway. So another example of someone that has gone on a commercialization journey, but really with a non-economic impact flavour, is Swati Gupta. Now, Swati was another one of our emerging innovators that came out of Callaghan Innovation. And Swati founded a company called Inclusis off the back of her program to develop her Talk With Me product, which is a resource that enables parents and educators to help children with autism to learn social interaction skills. So it gets children and teens with autism comfortable with proactive conversations via things like symbols and sounds. Inclusis is now based out of Auckland and also Delhi in India. And at present, they've got users that are located across the US, India, New Zealand, Australia, and Singapore. So a really nice example of how something that's come through a commercialisation kaupapa that has gone on to have a real major sort of social impact that wasn't necessarily set up to kind of think about the big dollars and the big money in the first place. Okay, we're getting down into the next level of detail now in terms of that commercialisation pathway. This is a diagram that I really like using, and that it comes from a European Commission report on knowledge transfer metrics. So for any kind of policy wonks or people that like a little bit of the detail, there's a QR code just down the bottom right of the slide, which takes you through to that report. But essentially what I love about this is it describes a series of processes that we think of as knowledge transfer channels. And this is sort of really some of the work that the iPEN group has been great at exploring. But basically what it says is that it can be quite confronting to think that as researchers and as research organizations, we don't actually directly create impact ourselves, that an important part of our role as researchers or as institutions is essentially to kind of move research out of the organization and get it into the hands of users, because ultimately it's the users that go on to create impact in the wider world. And so I kind of like this diagram because you can put a nice pink box in this case around the first two boxes on the left-hand side. And for me, that really speaks to the important role that research organizations play in helping that knowledge flow out into the wider world. And then as researchers, we essentially kind of cover that first bit, but not forgetting that our institutions cover the whole gambit. And so when we're thinking about commercialization, I'm actually talking about that just one of the channels here that might go on to essentially get into the hands of users that looks like startups, spin-outs, or things like licensing, et cetera. And it's actually critical to point that out because there are people within our organizations that are there, and it's their role, and it's important that we have these people to look after those channels and to make them work. And so for me, that starts to speak to the role that researchers can play here, is that I would hope that you're never in a position where you're feeling like you're having to do all of the stuff by yourself, that there should be people that you can work with to kind of help build up these pathways in order to be successful. But I think that knowledge transfer bit of the ecosystem is often not so visible or less well understood. But I think it's really important that we're starting to talk about these pathways in a little bit more detail. So at this point, I want to just acknowledge the work that, again, that iPEN have done. And this is something that's come out recently from some of the impact pathway analysis they've done. And massive caveat up front that this is a work in progress. And they're really actively iterating this at the moment. They've only just recently shared this with some of their initial discussion group of stakeholders, particularly looking at the Te Ao Māori pathway as something that is, just a first stab, and is really probably something that's going to look much more integrated as this is iterated over time. But what I really love about this diagram is it really points to almost the different flavors or the different ice cream flavors of impact pathways that are relevant across the CRI system. So we can talk about the government pathway that might look like the interface with policy. We can talk about flows into industry. We can talk about flows into community and the public, and we can talk about commercialization, all underpinned by that knowledge pathway, which is really critical. So I really love the way that this is presented. So I think today we're really kind of talking about that pathway on the far right. And really what I wanted to say here is that I see the commercialization pathway as being distinct from another important pathway for CRIs, which is that what I call direct transfer, or almost contract research pathway that goes directly into industry. So a number of you, of course, work and support sectors that align with the research that your CRI carries out. And there's a lot of important work and collaboration that goes on in providing science and research and services that flows directly into industry. When I'm thinking about commercialization, I'm talking about where we've got research and knowledge, where we're not exactly sure what that pathway is going to look like for that research to become a product and service. So it's where we're not necessarily flowing into a pre-existing business model, where we might have to do some business model to development to understand exactly where that pathway will look like and how it will flow. So we often are working on things that perhaps look sometimes a bit more disruptive, that might not have an obvious place in which they will fit longer horizon type technologies as well. I am generalizing, of course. Okay, so this is another kind of zooming in, I suppose, on that commercialization pathway. So I'm sort of gradually funneling you in, and I'm focusing now really just on the ones that look like licensing and creation of new companies. So whether they're spin-outs, startups, or joint ventures. And essentially, this is what we call the Valley of Death diagram, and it basically says that as funding for research from a public research perspective starts to tail off along that development pathway, there's a gap between when the research finishes and perhaps the private sector is ready to take that up and to develop it further. And it's that gap in the middle that we're often trying to support from the kind of research commercialization space. So that gap, again, it really is filled by people within our research organizations where they're trying to kind of develop or work up some sort of business model to de-risk the technology to a point where it can be taken up by the private sector. So we often talk about that progression as getting the technology to a point of investor readiness or getting it to investor ready. And you can almost imagine that there are sort of similar kind of valley of death gaps across other impact pathways as well. It's actually a really nice analogy. Some of the common outcomes that we see from there in our space look like licensing of IP to an existing business. So this is where we develop the technology sufficiently that there's an existing company, whether it's in New Zealand or offshore, that is willing to go, yep, we can see the value of this now. We can think we can use this and build it into our existing business model. We will pay your organization the rights to use that technology and pay a royalty stream back into the institution for the rights to use that technology and develop it further. The other two are kind of some similar flavors of the same thing, a spin-out company. So this is where there's no existing entity that is really well placed to be able to kind of develop the technology further and take it into the world. And so this is where we probably need to look at spinning out a new company or creating a new startup alongside venture capital or other investors, because we're developing a new business model, or we're doing something that has lots of applications across lots of different verticals or different markets. And then a joint venture is kind of like you can imagine somewhere in between. So you might be forming a new kind of entity, but you might be doing that alongside an existing corporate that might be interested in developing their business into a new area or feel that they can actually help that venture to be successful. So they're willing to come alongside and put in some of their own money or resources to help that to be successful. So those are kind of our three kind of main flavors that we often talk about. And there are other variations of that as well. So at this point, I wanted to talk about Chris Smith as an example of a spin-out company or someone that's formed a spin-out company. So Chris, again, another one of our emerging innovators that came out of Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research. And he formed a company called the Mushroom Smith, which is a commercial scale production of fungi traditionally collected and eaten by Māori. And his specialty, his technical knowledge was he had sort of good technical knowledge rather than commercializing. And part of the pathway that Chris took this project was to actually focus on the mushrooms as taonga and really focusing on making sure that any commercial operations sat with iwi because of the Mātauranga Māori focus of the project and the technology. So the outcome from his journey was to work directly with Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei up in Auckland to help them to preserve and commercialize the taonga, and focusing on growing the mushrooms with iwi and educating their community and helping them to uptake the scientific research and having a more of that local focus. But again, that's been a really nice success story and something that it is an example where a commercialization story that's had a cultural impact alongside. Okay, so drilling in a little bit further now, the commercialisation mahi, what does it actually look like? Well, we often talk about the critical role of commercialisation professionals that sit sort of in the middle. So these are these sort of mystical, sometimes not very well known people within your organisations that look after that critical connecting role in the middle. So this is that in that death in that middle, it's about bridging that gap between research on one side and business on the other. So these are the people that work behind the scenes to make sort of groundbreaking scientific results a reality along this commercialization journey. And they they're a specialist workforce with a unique skill set and a broad knowledge base to devise IP strategy and project manage the research idea towards the best route to investor readiness. And it's the kind of that commercialization professional that holds that kind of central relationship role to straddle research on one side and the language of research on one side and the language of industry corporates and investors on the others. So it's really is about building business models around your research idea. And what I would say up front is that if you're keen to dip your toe in the water in the commercialization pathway, if it's something you feel is relevant for you, absolutely find these people in your organization because they're there to help and they have a lot of deep knowledge and expertise in how to do that bit in the middle and create those business models. So when I talk about business models, essentially what I mean by that is it's essentially a plan for how a research-based innovation will be brought to market to create value for customers and stakeholders. So some of the activities that we often see in there around identifying and validating potential markets, about developing and protecting the IP, and about securing funding, resources and partnerships to essentially wrap that into something that can then be taken up by that downstream entity outside of the research institution that will continue and complete the commercialization process. And part of what we do through KiwiNet is we provide funding to enable a lot of that initial business model workup to happen. So what will often happen is a researcher, and I'm finding this in quite a kind of a basic term, and it doesn't always work like this, but a researcher will talk to their commercialization people and say, hey, I've got this cool invention that might have potential to be a new product and service. So the first thing they're really trying to determine is to go, right, well, have we actually got something here? Have we got a thing? And is there a viable business model that we can potentially develop around that thing? So some of the activities that initially are carried out is what we call market validation. So we're trying to determine, is there a validated market of essentially of next users or end users that's worth pursuing? What is the size of that group of users in New Zealand or overseas? Technology feasibility. Can the technology feasibly deliver on that market opportunity to create a solution to that problem? And developing an IP strategy around that. So do we have freedom to operate in the areas in which we're looking to move into? And is the technology protectable? So that's when we start talking about things like patents or trade secrets or other kind of mechanisms to enable that IP to have the right to kind of to use and develop that IP to a point where we can invest and develop it further. And so ultimately, we're trying to determine, is there a viable business model that can firstly maximize benefit to New Zealand, because that's really important. Is it commercially viable? And can we wrap that all together into a plan to get the thing to investor readiness where it could be taken up by someone in the private sector that's got the skills and the know-how and the funding to be able to kind of get it into the market? And I think the important thing here is that for me, it's about switching from perhaps a mode that we're in when we're carrying out our research, which is 80 or 90% about the scientific hypothesis or the research hypothesis, with a little bit of like, we kind of think we might know what the end user might look like or what the implementation pathway might be, and actually flipping it around the other way. So we're really getting into the nitty gritty around validating our market hypothesis and our commercialization hypothesis around our pathway. Of course, the science hypothesis is still critical because we need to make sure we can still develop and do the thing that we're hoping it can do, but we're really looking at it in a more of a market kind of setting and making sure that we're validating that it can actually do something within the market and that there's actually people out there that have the problem that we're trying to fix and we can feasibly address that. Okay, moving right along. So it's definitely a team sport. And what I would say here, and this starts to speak to the impact pathway diagram that I put up earlier, is that as we kind of move through this commercialization journey and we go from, in a rudimentary way, like research down one end and scaling into market in the other, there's a whole lot of different people and stakeholders that would get involved in that process. What I really should say here is it's not a linear process. So we don't kind of like, in the perfect world, we wouldn't be kind of like just doing our research, then going and talking to our commercialization people and going, hey, I've got this thing, how about we commercialize it? And then we get down to the far end and we go, oh, hey, users, or hey, investors, we've got this thing that we've worked up, who wants to buy it? Like a lot of impact pathways, the way that things work most effectively is if you can get as many of your end users and stakeholders involved in that process up front. So really down at that research formalization end. And that speaks to a lot of the great work that's going on across the CRIs now to kind of engage users, whether they be end users or next users or whoever, in research as we're developing it and we're starting that journey. Because what we've found is that, you need different people at different stages of the journey. All of the people that are involved in the process need to understand each other and to be able to engage. So it's all about relationships up front, and you need to form those early. And 9 to 10, when things do go wrong, we're working in a high risk space where things are likely to be unsuccessful than successful. So often it comes down to misunderstanding, miscommunication, and or misalignment around the common challenges that we're facing as we're going through. And the one way to kind of solve that is to build strong relationships up front and build those relationships in alignment as you go through the process. So I couldn't reiterate that enough, that really how important it is to engage some of those stakeholders and downstream users in your pathway as much as you can up front. And on that, I just really want to acknowledge some of the great work that CIFTI, the National Research Challenge for Science, Technology, Innovation, has done recently. This is a report that they released last year on building New Zealand's capacity for science-based open innovation. And what I love about this report is it's really kind of research-led thinking into that whole end user engagement in research, and that how we can kind of start to support some of those pathways through engagement early. And so well worth a read for those of you that want to see some of the evidence around how these interactions are critical. Okay, now we're going to talk about how it works in New Zealand. So in New Zealand, we have a thing called the Commercialisation Partner Network. So we're getting into acronym territory now, or the CPN, of which KiwiNet is a partner. And alongside that, we've got the Pre-Seed Accelerator Fund. So those two mechanisms are quite unique to New Zealand in that they provide support for early stage commercialisation right at that bit that sits within research organisations. And the philosophy behind our mechanisms in New Zealand is that we're quite a small country, we're quite spread out, we've got sort of a lot of institutions that it's really difficult to build up scale and funding and expertise and networks to be able to kind of really do commercialization well. So it probably makes more sense in New Zealand to be working together and collaborating to share knowledge and networks rather than going it alone. And the key stakeholders, or the people that help to support that in New Zealand, are Return on Science and Momentum, which are initiatives run out of the University of Auckland Uni Services, and KiwiNet, of course, as well. So I think about the CPN as almost like all of the stuff that helps to build the ecosystem and build the engine of commercialization. And the Pre-Seed Accelerator Fund is a bit like the petrol that goes in the engine. So that provides the early stage funding to support the projects out to investor readiness. KiwiNet has grown since its precursor organisation was founded in 2008. So we've been around for quite a while now. And again, it was started by 4 organisations coming together and saying, hey, why don't we work together and share our commercialisation funding around a little investment committee? And over the time, it's grown, and we've now got quite a large consortium of all of the CRIs and most of the universities. And it really is about working together around that fund and sharing that knowledge and networks around our investment committee. And for those of you that are progressing projects, particularly from the CRIs through commercialisation, then you would have had some engagement, hopefully, with KiwiNet over that time. Just thought a quick mention of like who's who in the zoo. Obviously, we work in a complex research science innovation system, and it's just worth mentioning some of the different entities that sit along that commercialisation pathway. I always like to mention the Centres of Research Excellence and the National Science Challenges, alongside, of course, our public research organisations as sort of cross-cutting institutions or initiatives that help to support R&D. And particularly SIFTI, we work very closely with as a natural science challenge that has quite close alignment with commercialisation kaupapa. And there's lots of collaboration we do with them to kind of help build up the pipeline of things that would come into our part of the ecosystem. So the KiwiNet and the commercialisation pathway, we kind of sit very firmly over that kind of valley of death, and we work really closely with the Callaghan Innovation as I suppose our agency that's there to support commercialisation in the private sector and R&D in the private sector, and working closely with the Callaghan Tech Incubators, where we're looking at opportunities that are going into that spin-out pathway in particular. And then further downstream, you've got New Zealand Growth Capital Partners, which help to provide venture capital and support the venture capital landscape into the technology system. NZT&E, who help with offshore markets and scale up. And then, of course, the angel networks are wonderful as well, that help to bring in all of those high net worth individuals, as well as other capital that's around the place to help provide funding to grow the technologies that are coming out of our system. Okay. Now, getting to the meaty bit, how researchers can engage in the system. So I've talked to you a lot about how my view of how commercialisation works and how it adds value as a pathway to impact. We've talked a little bit about how it works in New Zealand and what support's available. The key point I want to make here is that you don't have to do it all yourselves. So I think one of the kind of the horror that I often see, and when I talk to some researchers, when I talk about all of the stuff we've spoken to now, they go, oh God, it means that I have to become a spin-out founder and do all of this work myself. And my take-home view is you absolutely don't have to. Like I say, and actually nor would you want to, because it's quite a specialised area of expertise in its own right, helping to build these business models around science and technology. And really, for me, it's about finding those people in your organisations that you can work with to help do the commercialisation, to progress your science along that commercialisation pathway, if that's what's relevant to you. As a researcher, there's a whole spectrum of roles in which you can play in that journey. I mean, I've spoken about people like Andrew Kralachek and people like Swati Gupta that have probably jumped all in and have gone down that kind of spin-out founder route. That's way down one end of the spectrum. And there's everything kind of all the way back through to, hang on, look, I'm an academic inventor. I acknowledge that some of the work that I'm doing is right for commercialisation. That's its pathway to impact. I will support that work along that pathway, but I'm not going to jump in and be a spin-out founder myself, and that's absolutely fine. The most important thing here is to get on the journey in some way. So you don't necessarily have to be the driver, or you don't have to even be the co-pilot. You might be the person that's sitting in the back seat. But the most important thing is to kind of understand how that pathway works a little bit and be willing to kind of engage and support your science along that journey. And ultimately, like, how could one person jump in and do all of that work that I've described? It's a real niche skill set in itself. And I think this is really acknowledging that we are all different and we have different drivers in terms of where we see ourselves going and what our natural skill sets are and where our comfort levels are. And again, that SIFTI report that I referred to has been really great at defining some of the different personas of scientists, where we start and what our drivers are. And they've postulated 4 personas, which I think are quite nice, around the different ways in which researchers might engage in something like a commercialization journey. So type 1 being kind of the traditional, really focused on believing that academic and industry should be distinct and have their own identity within that kind of more academic or research context, all the way down the other end, which might be someone that's gone all in and has become the entrepreneur. And what I would say is that I love the 2 in the middle, because I think those are the classic, you can have your cake and eat it too modes. You can participate in the commercialization journey, but you don't have to do it all yourself. And actually, I would say that would be in the majority. Some of the things that KiwiNet offers, if you want to dip your toe in the water and to start learning about how commercialization works, even before you've even got involved yourself, Get Funded is an in-person one-day experience that we run that has mentorship, market validation, lean canvassing, customer discovery, and an opportunity assessment tools that enable you to get deeper insights when marshalling an idea into shape or taking your project to that next level. So some of the things you'll learn at Get Funded are identifying a value proposition. So how to assess an opportunity and narrow down on a core value proposition that meets an identified market need. Understanding the 3, what we call abilities. So working through feasibility, viability, and desirability, and how all of those things need to align to get the best chances of success. and getting an idea of what it takes to prepare an investment or funding case. So what's really cool about Get Funded, it's not just about commercializing something, but it's actually really valuable in helping to formulate research proposals, particularly the things like Endeavour Fund, et cetera, et cetera. And the next one's coming up on the 17th of May in Christchurch. So if you're keen for that, we do have limited spaces available for that one. So I definitely encourage you. I think registration's now open if you jump on our website and sign up for that one coming up in a few weeks' time. Secondly is Rewa Ake. Now, Rewa Ake is an online workshop series focused more on end user and customer engagement. So it supports you in helping to go out and have conversations with what you've identified as your end users for your research. So really good to kind of help to elevate your idea and starting those relationships to get your research out into market. So that workshop really covers things like framing customer conversations, developing searching questions, active listening. Don't go and sell your baby, go and talk to people about their problems and how you can solve that, language and positioning, and segmentation and feedback. And we don't have a fixed date for that at the moment, but we do have another Rewa Ake coming up later on in the year. And then this is probably the jewel in our crown in terms of programs to help researchers to engage in the commercialization process. Is the KiwiNet's Emerging Innovator Program, which is where we identify through the commercialization teams in our institutions, researchers that have got a bit of that entrepreneurial spark and are keen to kind of jump in a bit more deeply into commercialization. And it's really about fast tracking you to success. So we'll pair you up with a mentor, we give you some funding to work on a project, and there's a whole kind of 6-month program, 6 to 12-month program of professional development, training, workshops, etc., to really help you to build up the skills that you need to be able to kind of walk this journey. I should reiterate, and again, most of our emerging innovators don't go all in and become spin-out founders. We do find that actually most of them get the skills and the confidence to be able to walk that commercialization journey for their science, and often go back and powerfully influence their colleagues within their institutions and help their colleagues to be able to walk this journey as well. So you don't have to be an all-in spin-out founder to jump into the Emerging Innovator Program. We've funded 100 people across the country in this program to date. Here's some of our alumni, which you may recognise. And we run intakes to the program 3 times a year. So there's lots of opportunities to jump into the Emerging Innovator Program if that's something you're interested in. And again, have a chat to your institution's commercialization team if you're interested in that program. I'm nearly finished. I'm only 5 minutes over, Cara. I'm sorry. So some easy actions you can take to get started, as I've banged on about for the last 40 minutes, is absolutely do what you can to build a relationship with your commercialization team or tech transfer office or whoever that is within your organization. They're your first port of call. I should say that often these people are quite, there's not many of them in the CRIs, often as many as there are in universities, and often they're not that obvious to identify. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with KiwiNet. We'd be more than happy to introduce you to those people or find them for you if you're not exactly sure who they are. You can sign up to our researcher newsletter, which is through the QR code that's on this slide, which we release all of the information about our workshops and everything that's going on for researchers in the commercialization space. And really, I just want to finish off by acknowledging that I know this is quite hard to do. It's hard to jump into commercialization for a lot of CRI researchers because simply you don't have time. And often you don't necessarily have permission to kind of go and speak with the people that are going to help you to engage. But don't, definitely keep trying. And that, I think things are quickly changing, through hopefully the Te Ara Paerangi reforms. We're really starting to see the importance of giving researchers more space to engage. The work that the iPEN network are doing to provide you with some more of those tools has been absolutely critical. So I just want to reinforce that this is a journey, that it may not happen with one project for you. But if anything, getting started will help you to kind of see more opportunities, and it will fall into place eventually. So definitely keep pushing and keep trying. Finally, the KiwiNet Research Commercialisation Awards are coming up on the 28th of September. Entries close in 2 weeks. If you know anyone within your organisations that might be a good fit for the awards, we'd love to have their nomination. And that's a great opportunity to come and see directly what's going on in the space, celebrate the success, and network with a load of interesting and diverse people from across the sector. Cool, and that's pretty much me. I just want to finally say that it really is an exciting and engaging space. There's a lot going on, and the commercialisation network in New Zealand is just really invigorating and rewarding. There's no shortage of, I think, meaty challenges out there, whether they be big global challenges or challenges for New Zealand that can be solved through commercialisation. I mean, as a scientist myself, I definitely didn't get into this for the kind of the dirty commercialization side. I got into this because I see the power that this process and this journey has in actually creating real world impact. And really, it's not a day goes by that I'm not feeling like I'm contributing in some small way to something that's truly meaningful in this kaupapa, and that it's really fulfilling the promise of what science can do. And what got me into science in the first place. So I really encourage you from today to do what you can to dip your toe in the water, and we're here to help in whichever way we can.
Thanks,
That's
James. We've got a few questions, but just a couple of points I want to thank you again. And I think one of the key things that you've sort of reiterated a whole bunch of messages that doesn't just apply to commercialization as an impact pathway. Impact from science and research comes as a result of the team sport piece, the relationships piece. It's a messy process piece. You know, even if anyone reflects on their own PhD journey, I know what I put in my proposal kind of only bears as passing resemblance to what I eventually did, because you don't know. So yeah, that's great. Thanks, James. We've got some questions in the chat, so I'm going to run through them as quickly as you can. Vern's put a couple, and the first one I just want to bring you back to is the point that you made early on about benefits to the rest of the world rather than holding them in New Zealand. Vern's just wondering if you're raising this flag with MB folks about where the benefits lie.
Yeah, I think it's raising it for everyone, really. That I think it's easy to kind of look at something that goes offshore and go, oh God, that's another thing that's been lost to New Zealand. Whereas actually the reality is we kind of need these things to go offshore in order to be successful. There will be many things that we can commercialize within New Zealand, and there's enough of a market for it to be self-sustaining here. That's absolutely cool. But I think we need to get to a more consistent dialogue as an ecosystem, and that includes MB as much as it includes our research organizations and our scientists, that actually it is okay for some things to go offshore. And actually, if anything, sometimes we should be encouraging that.
Yeah, and so I suppose, and I think a lot of us kind of already appreciate that. I think some people find particularly the would you call them constraints, particularly with endeavours, right, which have a very tight focus. And I suppose I think Vern's question was really, are you using any of your influence with Endeavour to maybe bring that to their attention?
Yeah, I'm absolutely doing my best.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, Vern here. I'm just exploring the extent to which the conversation is happening with what is our largest science fund, one of our largest science funds in New Zealand, because the benefit to New Zealand definitions probably don't include that understanding at the moment. And
I think you're absolutely right.
It should be explored, the conversation had, so that, you know, the people that would be assessing these proposals, if we were to put that pathway inside of there, we'll probably not, you know, would it be appreciated as a viable pathway for benefit coming back to New Zealand? That's what I want to understand.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and I completely agree. I think, and again, as much as we're having this conversation here, there are parallel conversations with our colleagues at MB to kind of help to get alignment on that.
Exactly.
But I think that's the one thing that is missing a lot is when we look at, you know, what comes down in terms of our research funds and policy, is it's often really ambiguous about what benefit to New Zealand actually is. So I think this is part of the problem, is we all talk about benefit to New Zealand, but it's not very consistently defined in terms of those outcomes. So I agree. I think if we had a bit more clarity and permission to be able to pursue some of these pathways, and we were comfortable in talking about it, then that would certainly help.
I'm going to be at the, so I see some of my colleagues are on the call as well. We are meeting with the Endeavour team tomorrow in Wellington. I may very well raise this on the side with a cup of tea with those who are running the program, and there might be some conversations coming your way, James, from some of those people in the team.
More than happy to help. And I'd
Yeah.
say the more we can get some of the great iPEN resources, like all the way through into the policy teams at MB, that would be really, really powerful too.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think James, your point is that it's not well understood because without it being a distraction, there are many cases that I can think of that you would say, yeah, does that count as a benefit to New Zealand or not? You know, even some companies simply cannot be commercially viable with just the New Zealand market. Okay.
Yeah.
Daniel, I'm going to see if I can weave your question in with Ayub's, where he was asking, James, do you think the structure, mechanisms and processes and research institutes in New Zealand allow, encourage and support effectively and efficiently innovation and commercialisation? And if not, what needs to be done about that?
Yeah, so I think the short answer is I think we've done pretty well, and I think we've built up a good kind of ecosystem so far, but there's definitely more to be done. So for me, there's two things to that. I think we need to encourage our research institutions to be supporting more of their research through to these kind of outcomes that look like the end of that commercialization, that initial journey. So getting things out to investor readiness. So part of that is giving permission and incentives to our institutions to do that. So for instance, the amount of times that I've heard that kind of perhaps misconception that CRIs aren't allowed to do spin-outs. You know, I could probably, if I had $1 for each time I'd heard that. But, you know, so things like that I think are really unhelpful, that I think as an ecosystem, we need to empower our institutions to be able to deliver more of these outcomes that are right for the research that has been done. And secondly, we need more resourcing for the commercialization people within each institution. So we've got enough of these talented people that can work alongside the research teams to build up these business models and to help to get things out. And without going into too much detail here, I've definitely got some ideas around that, but I think we need to kind of think about how we fund those teams within CRIs, but without the expectation that they have to generate some sort of monetary return for the institution.
Okay, thanks. And probably a nice segue is Matthew asked a question about, as a scientist, what's the best way to identify needs of the end users and who can help facilitate market-driven science? You kind of touched on some of the options that you have from a KiwiNet offering training and stuff, which is all really, you know, really worthwhile, and is the kind of, as I was saying before, the kind of tools that you can apply to engage with any end user, whether it has a commercial, even if it's a whiff of commercial opportunity, or if it's more public good. But what else can researchers do, James?
Yeah, I think it's really context specific, I'd say that, and again, we're really happy to help to provide sort of connections into either people within your institution that are working on the stuff, or that might be appropriate for the particular research that you're doing in terms of sector focus or what have you. Obviously, there's the 2 workshops that we run. They're actually a really, really good way to kind of start to understand what's in the toolbox and how to use the tools. I would also say that this isn't about sort of basic research versus applied or market driven as well, that I actually find that there's something enriching to be had from having these conversations with potential users of our research, regardless of what we do. And I've actually, you know, probably seen the most disruptive things that have come out as the big game-changing technologies that have come through our space have actually been things that were unexpected, that came out of some fundamental research that no one really envisaged what that application might look like. But the critical part was that when that research got going and that discovery was made, that the researchers had relationships, or they were willing to go and talk with people to engage, to understand how that might add value out in the real world. So I think it's about just, you know, having that courage and that ability to kind of talk with people that are relevant to your work is key. And again, I would say there's some general resources out there, but a lot of it will be contextual.
Megan has actually asked a really good question, because, you know, it's a little bit like, what's the investment of my time? She was wondering if you could tell us approximately how many applications you get for the Pre-Seed Accelerator Fund, and how many are funded and how many get fast failed.
Oh yeah, cool. No, that's a great question, because one of the nice things about the Pre-Seed Accelerator Fund, well, firstly, it's all it's driven by the commercialisation people within your institution. We have 2 levels of funding. We have Tier 1, which is essentially on demand. So up to about $40,000 of pre-seed funding, which is then matched 40K with from your institution. It's on demand. So they just tell us they're starting the project. So to do a lot of that early stage work that I talked about around validating the business model, that just happens. And within that, the whole idea is that we want to be able to kind of work this up and test that market hypothesis as quickly and as efficiently as possible without too many bureaucratic hurdles. And then of those projects, we would get probably about 50% of them would be a fast fail. That actually the market hypothesis that we thought was there is probably not valid, or we can't protect the IP or whatever. And then a proportion of those would then get worked up into bigger projects, which is our Tier 2 funding, which comes through our investment committee. And really what we're trying to do there is not so much like a research, like an Endeavour Fund program where we're going, we want to fund, say, 20%. We're really going, well, look, the research has already been done here. New Zealand's already made the investment in developing the science. How can we best support this to be able to get out into the world where it can create some impact? So we're really trying to look at ways in which we can say yes, because if we can say yes, then we're confident that there's a pathway there for that business model to be developed where it can actually get out into the world and be put to use. So we have quite a different philosophy, but I would say projects that come to our investment committee, you're probably looking about probably about a 30% failure rate. And then some of those might come back for a rebid at a later stage.
Probably, James, one of the other things, tell me if I'm wrong, that from my understanding, the way KiwiNet works as well, which is different to something like Endeavour, is by taking some of this in front of a committee, you're actually creating opportunities for follow-up conversations and a little more feedback and, a little bit more of a genuine helping hand than what often happens with research funding. Would that be right?
100%. Yeah. So it's really taking that team sport analogy and extending it across New Zealand, that the people in our investment committee are commercialisation leaders from across our research institutions, including the CRIs and the universities and some of the IROs, and with independent members from private sector that have got that grey hairs and scars on their back from having done this stuff in the past. And again, it's really about how can we leverage our knowledge and our networks as much as we can to enable these projects to be successful. So we get a lot of contacts and connections and follow-up support that comes out of those presentations.
Cool. We're at 1 o'clock, but I've got one final question I think it would be good for you to just answer from Bryony about the potential future business paradigms and whether or not how you see KiwiNet supporting alternative commercial pathways to impact, like through social enterprise. Is that sort of part of what you're thinking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I put up my kind of 3 flavors, and often, we can look at those 3 flavors and go, hang on, that's a very kind of Western, kind of old school kind of approach to business models and how we might progress this. The reality is really what we're trying to aim for here is to get something to some sort of sustainable business model. So that could look like a social enterprise, absolutely. But the key thing here is that there needs to be some way for whatever that model is, it has to be able to financially sustain itself. Or there has to be someone at the end that says, yes, we will fund that on the next journey. And if we can't identify that, then we kind of almost feel like, well, what are we doing? So a social enterprise might be the pathway. So, I mean, I would look at what Swati is doing with Talk With Me and go, that has kind of a social enterprise kind of flavor to it. In the same way in which we might identify a partnership with iwi, might not look like a traditional Western business model, but there's something in there that is about enabling that commercial entity to be sustainable, so it can take that underpinning science, the core of that thing, and actually get it out and deliver value or benefit to customers and benefit to the world. So there are lots of models in there, but it has to be financially sustainable. That's the core.
Yeah. All right. Well, we better close. It's 2 minutes past. So I want to say a huge thanks to you again, James, for joining us, and to all of you. I would just encourage you to use, KiwiNet is partly funded by all of the CRIs. So use that opportunity, access the feedback, the knowledge, the skills, and the resources that are available. So do get in touch. Otherwise, I want to say, yeah, thank you, James. Also, just a quick plug for our iPEN webinar for next month, which is going to be featuring Dion. He's just going to be sharing some of his own experiences and how he's been just making ripples in the impact area. So come along to that. And don't forget, you can watch our old, and if you've missed any of our webinars, you can see them all on our Vimeo page. I'll just quickly paste that in now, and this one will be loaded up there hopefully in the next day or so. So thanks, James. Really appreciate you coming along for us, and I want to say a ka kite anō to the rest of you. Have a great rest of your day, and stay safe and stay well.